Dr. Warner is the Avidas Donabedian Distinguished University Professor Emeritus at the School of Public Health. He's a Dean Emeritus at the School of Public Health and Professor Emeritus of Health Policy and Health Management and Policy at the University of Michigan. He will discuss the contribution of modeling studies to tobacco regulations from a scientific perspective. Dr. Warner, please take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, so thank you, Ritesh, and I apologize for the bobbling around there. First of all, here are my disclosures. I'm supported by our T-Course grant, and I have no conflicts of interest to report. In the brief time that I've been allotted, my goal is simply to try to introduce how computational modeling can contribute to tobacco regulatory science decision-making. Where I provide examples of modeling, I'm going to draw primarily from our center. I'm going to start by addressing a fundamental question, and that is, why modeling? Why is it useful for tobacco regulation? And in some instances, why is it essential? The answer lies in the fact that most tobacco policy research either uses data from actual past experiences regarding behavior or involves experiments or surveys that cannot perfectly mimic real-world conditions. Let me give you an example. There's a wealth of studies of the effects of cigarette taxes on the demand for cigarettes. Employing their findings, it's a pretty simple matter to predict the effects of a contemplated increase in the cigarette excise tax in a given state or country. It is much more difficult to evaluate the likely effects of adopting policies or regulations that have never existed previously, and hence for which there is no data on real-world experience. Non-modeling research can certainly make important contributions here, but translating that research into the effects of a truly novel regulation is problematic at best. So let me illustrate that here. With an interest in a nicotine reduction regulation, researchers have conducted a significant number of experiments studying smokers' responses to reduce nicotine cigarettes. These experiments have generated valuable findings that can definitely inform consideration of a nicotine reduction regulation. However, because these experiments can't proceed under real-world conditions, they can't tell us how smokers would respond were FDA to actually implement a nicotine reduction regulation. Further, they represent only one aspect of a very complex set of interactions that would ultimately determine how a nicotine reduction regulation would play out. So just consider, for example, we have to worry about the development of a black market in regular nicotine cigarettes, or the development of novel products that allow smokers to add nicotine to their reduced nicotine cigarettes. How would the availability or the unavailability of consumer attractive reduced risk nicotine products like e-cigarettes affect the response to very low nicotine cigarettes? We don't know the answer to those. So this is where modeling comes in. Modeling offers us the possibility of evaluating the consequences of novel, complicated regulations by combining pieces of the puzzle in a mathematical framework and allowing the researcher, or for that matter, the policy decision maker, to vary assumptions about the values of variables or the relationships between them. This permits assessment of a plausible range of outcomes. The complexity of interactions among a sizable number of factors means that without modeling, we can't foresee how those interactions will ultimately affect outcomes of interest. Herein, therefore, lies the greatest strength of, and indeed the need for, models. We can't know the consequences of a truly novel regulation. Models give us a tool to evaluate the range of possible outcomes and thereby to answer a critical qualitative question. Is the regulation likely to benefit the public health? Forecasting the outcome of a novel intervention is probably the most important application of tobacco regulatory science models. And momentarily, I'm going to discuss applications both current and future. But first, I want to illustrate another use of models, one with indirect application to tobacco regulatory science. Models can be used to assess what would have happened in the past under the condition of a counterfactual, something different from what actually occurred. We can't measure the outcome because the relevant conditions haven't held when we're talking about a situation with a counterfactual. But what we can do is we can model the situation and estimate what would have been likely to have occurred. Here's an important example of this counterfactual issue. This is one that's published by David Levy and his colleagues in 2021. The study has a meaningful indirect contribution to make to the assessment of a possible national nicotine reduction regulation. Why? Because it demonstrates the extraordinary toll of having permitted regular nicotine cigarettes to be sold in the country for the past several decades. And therefore, it demonstrates the value of adopting a reduced nicotine regulation in the near future. The authors documented that the industry had the ability to extract nicotine from cigarettes decades before the very first Surgeon General's report in 1964. The authors then estimated the mortality toll of smoking if the industry had reduced cigarettes' nicotine yields to non-addicting levels in 1965, that's the year after the first Surgeon General's report, or 1975 or 1985. Had the industry sold only very low nicotine cigarettes, VLNCs, starting in 1965, and I hope you are looking at a slide here with the results, the authors estimated that 21 million smoking attributable deaths would have been averted over the following century, with 272 million life years gained. You can also see the results had the industry implemented VLNCs in 1975 and 85. This study is a powerful demonstration of the toll of addiction to cigarettes. As much insight as counterfactual studies can generate, however, I believe the more important use of models for purposes of tobacco regulatory decision-making is evaluating likely future effects of novel regulations. I'll illustrate this first with the reduced nicotine modeling study produced by researchers at the FDA's Center for Tobacco Products. Then I'll turn to a prohibition of menthol in cigarettes and all flavors in cigars. So in 2018, Ben Appleberg and his CPP colleagues published an article on reduced nicotine in the New England Journal of Medicine. It's received quite a lot of attention, deservedly so. As you can see in Table 2 here, the authors estimated that implementation of a reduced nicotine standard in 2020 would have decreased the cumulative number of smokers by 2.4 million just 5 years later, and by 33.1 million by the end of the 21st century. In Table 3, you can see the authors estimated that by the end of the century, a nicotine reduction policy would have averted 8.5 million deaths and gained over 134 million life years. These are median estimates. There's a wide range around them. But the qualitative point is that the regulation would greatly reduce the number of smokers and avert a substantial number of avoidable premature deaths. FDA is further along on product standards banning menthol in cigarettes and all flavors in cigars. The agency has announced that it's committed to completing the rulemaking process this year. The product standards relied heavily on evidence that includes that which is produced by modeling simulations. The menthol ban has a lengthy history, as do modeling contributions to it. The 2009 Tobacco Control Act charged the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee, that's TPSAC, with determining whether menthol should be banned from cigarettes. TPSAC's deliberations were aided by findings from a simulation model produced by David Mendez that demonstrated that a menthol ban would significantly reduce the mortality toll from smoking. Ultimately, the committee concluded that it was in the interest of public health to prohibit menthol. The Center for Tobacco Products then undertook its own study and arrived at the same conclusion. Nevertheless, the agency failed until recently to act to ban menthol. Dating from the early assessment of menthol, but especially recently, researchers have published a series of important papers. They report the results of simulations of the health burden menthol creates, both in general and specifically for the African American population. And they provide evidence that a ban on menthol will reduce smoking and smoking-related mortality. I think of this work as a superb example of the contribution that modeling research can make and has made to tobacco regulation decision-making. So how can modeling research contribute to such decision-making going forward? I'm going to give you 3 examples here. Looking to the future, undoubtedly the most visible and radical proposed regulation is the nicotine reduction regulation. Modeling holds the potential of developing the evidentiary base needed for a reduced nicotine standard, and in the process, significantly speeding the production of the requisite evidence. Our TCORS is is tackling the task now, led by David Mendez with, as I noted, help from the informative experimental studies. Another issue is perhaps more near term than nicotine regulation, made especially relevant by the menthol regulation. How will the effects of a menthol ban in combustible tobacco products be affected by the presence or absence of reduced risk products with menthol? This is an important and again challenging question that our CAsToR researchers led by David Levy have begun to address. Thirdly, a subject receiving increasing attention in tobacco control research in general, Brian mentioned this at the e-cigarette summit yesterday, gave it a lot of emphasis, is especially ripe for examination in the context of modeling research. I'm talking about addressing disparities. Several CAsToR researchers are focusing laser-like on disparities research. I'm going to mention just 2 areas of current and future work. Excuse me. One area of very great importance is how tobacco regulations can and do affect people who suffer from mental health problems, a group that has an unusually high smoking prevalence. Jamie Tam has focused much of her research on this subject. Along with her colleagues, she recently published the modeling paper that you see here in Preventive Medicine. A second area involves studying disparities in poly-tobacco use by SES and race and ethnicity. This effort is centered in our Project 3 research group led by Nancy Fleischer. This work is essential to evaluating future patterns of poly-tobacco use, their health consequences, and their impacts for regulation. Last month, the group published a series of articles in a special supplement to the American Journal of Preventive Medicine that examined birth cohort-specific smoking patterns in the U.S. by race, ethnicity, educational attainment, and family income. This research is providing important model parameters on initiation rates, cessation rates, and product use intensity by cohort, sex, age, and sociodemographic characteristics. The work has informed some of our previous modeling studies and will certainly well serve the interests of our simulation modeling going forward. I want to conclude, and yes, you're looking at a blank slide now. I want to conclude that we all appreciate that while good science is a necessary condition for FDA's adoption of a tobacco regulation, it is not sufficient. Any proposed regulation that threatens cigarette sales is going to confront an onslaught of political and legal objections. That is frustrating for all of us, no doubt, especially so for Dr. King and his CTP colleagues. Still, as scientists, we are privileged to help to provide that necessary research-based input. Without it, no regulations would ever see the light of day. Thank you.